So good morning to you all. Today we're going to start with exercise 108. And this one, to me, is kind of fun because we're actually going to start faking things in Photoshop. And I do this early on in the semester because I think it's good for you to get the idea of how do we start to integrate pieces that don't belong together. And it helps certainly for your assignment that's due on Wednesday to go through this process. But this is something that will come back in quite a bit later in the semester. We'll do some more collage work. We'll take this a step further. So this is the basics, but we'll push the boundaries just a little bit as we go forward. But the idea here is that we'll take a scene that exists somewhere, and we'll figure out how to put people into that scene and make it look like it's a real photograph. And the thing about Photoshop is if we carefully consider this sort of thing, we can actually fabricate almost anything that we want. It's just a matter of having the component pieces and thinking carefully about how they come together. So today we're going to concentrate on putting people into a scene. And I have, under exercise 108, I've gone ahead and I pulled that up here for you guys. You just go to typical exercises, go to exercise 108. And at the bottom, there's a bunch of examples, and these are all Flickr images. If you want to pick your own streets, I'm fine with it. These are ones that I found that have worked pretty well. We're going to start by doing a city street, and then we're also going to do a landscape, so you can see how you would do the same thing in both scenarios. I'm going to go ahead and just open these up real quick so that you guys can see the variety that are here, and then we'll talk through them in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the idea behind these streets is that I tried to pick something that was, number one, empty, because if we're going to put elements into the scene, it doesn't make sense to have the scene already full of stuff. So the streets are empty. They also have pretty telltale shadows somewhere in the scene that gives you an idea of what your shadows should look like. Obviously, they're loading up a little bit slow. This is a good one. I'm either going to do probably this one or I'll do this one as my examples. I'll probably do this one because it works pretty well and there's some tricky things in it that'll work nicely. But any one of these would work just fine. This one would work just fine as well. Then I have some Yosemite scenes that are here. And I'll use these scenes, one of these. I'll probably use this one as my example of integrating somebody into a nature scene, so a landscape orientation. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Photoshop. And I'll pick that first scene that I was going to work with. So I'm going to go to File and then Open. And I have these scenes already saved on my flash drive, so I don't have to download them. There we go. So there's that scene that I was talking about. I think this is a particularly good one because the shadows are strong and there is a little curb, and we can talk about how to deal with the curb as well. I'm going to go ahead and open up one more of them, though, just for comparison purposes so that you can see different examples. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to kind of look at this photograph and analyze what's happening in the photograph and find some kind of key important elements in the photograph to work from. So the first thing, I'm guessing a lot of you have taken 130 by now. If you haven't taken 130, it's possible that you discussed the things that I'm talking about in 130. Otherwise, we're going to discuss them here. I need to do a little bit of drawing in order to explain this. So this is not something that you have to follow along with. But I need to switch and have a red brush so that you guys can see this. And let me up this size here so that I'm going to draw some stuff on the scene. You don't have to draw it. It'll help me explain what's really happening in the scene. So this view, looking right down the center of this street, is what's called a one-point perspective, which essentially means that all of the elements of the scene point toward a single point in the center. We can have something called the two-point perspective, where we have some elements pointing off to the left, some elements pointing off to the right. But in this example, everything's pointing toward the center. So if I started to align this up, if, for example, I drew a line that went through all of these light posts, and I continued down, it would end up somewhere right about there in the center. And how convenient. It's not, hold on a second, you guys aren't, there we go. Now you can see it in red. Likewise, if I were to take a line along this curb and extend it out there, see how these are all kind of pointing at the same general area? Now, if we were really constructing this, we'd take our time and really line it up and whatever. And there's also problems, like the street curves away, so I have to kind of project that out. Likewise, even the center line of the street kind of roughly points in that same point. So this right there is that point that we kind of care about. So let me go ahead and turn those off for a second. And as I look at these, what that's identifying is something that's called the horizon line. And what the horizon line is imagine yourself standing on the beach, and you're looking out at the ocean, right? And at some point, the earth curves away from you, and you see a horizon where the ocean meets the sky. That horizon line is in all of these photos. There might be stuff in the way. So in this case, there's buildings and stuff in the way, but that horizon still exists. And so I want to identify what that horizon is, and I'm going to use a guide to drop a horizontal line down right at that horizon. And the way that I do that is I click and drag from the rulers to create this. If you don't see your rulers right now, you can go up to View, and you can check the little box for rulers, and your rulers will show up. And then I can drag a line down from the ruler, and you see that I get that perfectly horizontal line. And I'm going to drop that line right at where I think the horizon line would be. And it takes a little bit of practice, but you can generally figure it out. This is really critical when we start to think about adding people to a scene, because it will help put the people in the right place. And I'll show you an example in just a second. So as I continue looking at the scene, I have the horizon line figured out. Let me turn off a few of my other little shapes here. We don't need to see those right now. I have the horizon line figured out, but I also need to look at the lighting of the scene. And you guys heard me talk a lot last class about lighting, lighting, lighting. That's how you make things match up. They have to have the same lighting conditions. So if I'm looking at this scene, I can tell that the sun is off to the right over here, kind of behind the viewer, because it's casting shadows down and onto the pavement. So I know that the sun is on that back right side. So if I'm looking for something to put into the scene, a person, for example, I need to make sure that the sun is shining on their right side and that the shadow is on their left side. That's ideal. So what I'll do is I'll go and look, and I have some already picked out, but let's see if there's anything that's newer. I'm going to go into the stuff that you guys cut out last class. If you have your own cutouts, great, you can use those. If you don't, you can go into the resources, you can go to Collage Images, and you can get in here and see people. Let's look at people. Actually, you know what? So that I use not one of the ones that's older, let me use one of your new ones. Let me go into Student Work, and I'm going to look at Exercise 107, which will show all of the work that you guys just did. And I'll pick one of these. So this takes some time. So if I were to look at this person, for example, right? The sun, or the light, is slightly behind the person, and it's shining on their left side. Well, I guess in this case it would be their right side. It depends on which way which way they're facing. But in this case, he's facing us, so it's on his left side, which is the opposite light condition from what I want. So that one's not the best choice. I don't know that I'm going to pick that one.
Flip that image?
I can flip the image. We'll get to that. A little too blurry. So it takes a little bit of time because you have to kind of sort out. This one's not bad. It's kind of universal lighting. I think it's a little bit more on this shoulder than it is on that shoulder. The shadow's kind of more over here. But I think I might be able to make this work. I just have to flip the person the other direction. So I'm going to leave this one open. Actually, I'm just going to open it in a new tab there. And one of the challenges with doing this is figuring out what the right person is to put into the scene. If you pick the wrong person, it's a lot harder to kind of sort that out. So this is more universal lighting in the back. The highlight's a little bit on the right there. So that one actually might work as well. Well, let's start. And like I said, I didn't pre-choose these. I have ones that I've pre-chosen, but I would rather go through and try to sort out I'm going to do this one a little bit later, I think. I think that'll be a good one, too. So let me open this into. OK, I'll just use one of these. I'll pick the man. Why not? OK, so first thing I need is I need the color version of this. So I'm going to right-click and say Save Link As. And I'll put it into my folder for today. I'm going to click Save. Those are the ones that I've already picked. But the other thing that I need is I need the gray version. So I'm going to make sure that I save that one as well. So I'll go to Save Link As, and we'll save it there as well. And now I need to bring that person into this scene. So I'm going to go to File and then Place. So this is a real easy way of getting something from a file into a scene, is to just go to File and then Place. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to pick that person. So there's the person. Remember, the lighting conditions were backwards from the way I wanted, so I need to flip him over the other direction. So I'll go up to Edit, Transform, and I'm going to flip. I think it's vertical. Nope, it's flip horizontal. Let me just undo that. Horizontal. Vertical. There we go. So now I have the light on the correct side. See how I worked through that a little bit? The other thing is, if this person was in fact this tall, he would be a giant on the street. So that wouldn't work. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink him down. Now notice when I first place this image in, it gives me a little box that goes around him, so it's easy to manipulate right now. So I want him to get smaller. Now the other thing about making him get smaller is I don't want to distort his proportions. Right? That's not going to work either. So when I do this, I want to hold down the Shift key on the keyboard so that I can keep him in proportion as I get his height correct. Now, if I were to make him like this, he looks inherently too small. Okay? And obviously, if he's here, he's too big. So remember, I had you find that horizon line. The magic thing about the horizon line is, generally speaking, if you put people's eyes on the horizon line, they're going to be the right size, and they're going to feel like they belong in a scene. The reason is because the photographer, chances are, took the image at eye level. Therefore, it's a straight shot to the horizon line. Now, is there some variant? Absolutely. Am I a little bit taller than somebody else? Could my eyes be a little bit above the horizon? Your eyes might be a little bit below the horizon? Absolutely. There's some play in it. It's just an approximation. If I want the person, I can move him over here so he's standing there, and he still feels like he's part of the scene in size. If I want him to go further into the scene, I can make him smaller, but instead of making him smaller this way, I make him smaller this way, and suddenly he's much further back, deeper into the scene. If I make him smaller still, notice I'm keeping his eyes still at that horizon line. He still seems like he belongs in the scene. Do you see how that magic works? And this is really understanding the perspective and making sure that your person is in the correct location and at the correct size. So for our purposes today, I want him to be a little bit bigger. And I'm going to move him over so that he's standing right there. I'll adjust his eye level, and maybe right there. That looks pretty good. When I'm done with all of this, I'll click the check mark up top and commit to that's the size, that's the placement that I want. Now, if I made a mistake and I say, oh, you know what, I put him in the wrong place, you can go back up to the Edit menu. You can go to this Free Transform, and you'll get that box back, and you can keep adjusting. So if you made a mistake, there's nothing wrong with that. So I'll go ahead and commit to it. There we go. The lighting conditions I'm happy with. He's got light on his backside. It matches up with where the sun's coming from. He's got shadow on this front side. All of that's pretty good. If you need to accentuate that a little bit, you could do a selective dodge and burn on him to kind of darken up one side a little bit more, and I'll get to that if it seems necessary after we get a little bit further along. So the other thing, though, we've got him into the scene. He feels like he kind of belongs in the scene, which is a good thing. But if we zoom in here and we look down at his feet right now, Do they seem like they belong in the scene? Nope. They look like they're just kind of stuck there, right? They're floating on top of the scene. So we need to fix that as well. And the way that we're going to fix that is we're going to work with some shadows in this scene to figure out how to compensate and make him feel like he belongs in this particular scene. So remember, I made you save the gray version in addition to the color version. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Place, and I'm going to bring in that gray version of him. There it is. I have to flip it again, so I'll go to Transform. Let's see if I can do it correctly this time. Flip horizontal. Good. And now I'm going to just kind of shrink this down so that it's the same size as the man here. And sometimes it's easiest to just kind of put it on top. You can use the arrow keys to nudge a little bit, but I want to make sure that it's roughly the same size. It doesn't have to be exact, but we're looking for it to be a little bit close. So now I have that shadow placed into the scene. It's on top of the person, but it's not in its correct orientation. Obviously, it's standing up like the person. So I need to look at this scene again, and I need to kind of identify what's happening in this scene and what's casting shadows in this scene. So if I look at the shadows on the ground here, obviously I have some long light post shadows, but this light post is in the shade, so the shadow that it's casting is down here. So that doesn't really help me too much. But if I look right there at that edge is in the sun, and that edge matches up quite nicely with this shadow right there. See that little arc that's right there? This point here is that point there. This point here is that point there. Does that kind of make sense? So I'm looking for some cue in the scene. So let me go ahead and go back to my line tool, and I'm going to draw something for reference here. So I'll draw that down. That's casting a shadow down. Oops. Make it red so you guys can see it. There we go. That's casting a shadow down in that direction. If I were to drop a straight line down here to the ground, to where that point meets the ground, like that, I can get an idea of where this triangle is falling. Does that make sense? You don't have to draw this. You can just mentally kind of see this as part of it. The other thing that you can do without doing these kinds of guides is you can look at the other shadows in the scene and just make sure your shadow is in the same orientation. But sometimes it helps to have these little lines. So I'm going to go back to the angle. So there's my angle piece right there. And I'm going to move that so that it's going by this guy's head. So we'll say about like that. And what that does is it gives me a target for where I want that shadow to end up, because I've got approximately the line. Now there's a little bit of work here, because I need to know kind of where the bottom of the shadow goes and where the top of the shadow goes, and I want it to be similar to this. So I could draw the whole triangle and work it out. But I'm looking for approximates. It's going to look either right or it's going to look wrong when you look at the photo. So now that I have that as a general guide, I'm going to come back to my shadow, which is right here. Let me rename this shadow. And let me rename this to man, just for clarity purposes. And so I'm going to take that shadow right here, and I'm going to use a transform that is called skew. You could use one of the other transforms, but to me, skew is the most controlled way of starting to manipulate this. This part does take practice to just kind of see what happens. But essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to work one corner at a time. And part of the reason that I like skew is that you work one corner at a time. Eventually, yes. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get these down in their proper position. Right? Now notice as I'm doing that, the bottom, his feet have changed their position. So I need to either move this whole thing so that they're under his feet, or I might need to do a little bit more skewing of this side of it as well. Doesn't have to be perfect under his feet, but we're looking for an approximation. In this particular example, his feet come together and they will hide any shadow really nicely. If you have two separate feet or when one foot is off the ground, it's a little bit harder to line up the shadow. It's still doable. Let me adjust that a little bit more up. There we go. Let's pull this one down like that. Let me adjust the head a little bit more. And about like that is close. Okay? So the shadow has a human-like shape. It's not just some arbitrary thing that I drew in. It actually is based on the person itself. Now there's a few problems here. One is that the shadow ends up on top of the person, and obviously we don't want that to be the case. So I'm going to change the order and put the person on top of the shadow. There we go. So now the shadow's there. I may need a few more little adjustments to that shadow based on the fact that his toe go out just a little bit. Yeah, about like that. I'm just using the arrow keys to make fine adjustments. So I have a little bit of shadow on his toe there, and there's his shadow extending. Now, this shadow, though, is gray, and I'm not seeing any of the pavement and lines and stuff below it. Look up here. See how I have the shadow, but I'm seeing the shadow on top of the line. Here's a perfect opportunity on the shadow to use one of our blending modes. So you can see how all the stuff that I've done and I've taught you over the last 2 weeks is leading into being able to do this. So now we apply the blending mode. So I'm going to go to an overlay blending mode. There we go. And so we see the shadow in place. Let me try a multiply. Well, in the overlay it was too light. In the multiply it was too dark. Let me do the multiply but change the opacity down till it seems like it's about the right lightness level. Okay? Do you guys see the other problem with this shadow, though? This shadow is a true gray, and the shadows in the scene are a blue. So there's a problem. So I need to make an adjustment to the color of this shadow to make it match that shadow. So you see how all these things are leading up to themselves. So I need to make an adjustment layer on top of the shadow. So I'll go up to my layer. I'll go to New Adjustment Layer. And in this case, I think I'm going to do a let me do a color balance. Yeah, that'll work. There's a color balance, but I don't want to affect the whole image. So right now, if I were to skew in the blue direction, for example, it affects the whole image. That wasn't what I wanted. So let me go back to 0 here. I want it to apply just to the shadow, and I can do that in Photoshop by selecting the shadow layer and then pressing Control, Alt, and G at the same time. And you see that it gets a little tiny arrow, and that arrow points down to the layer directly below it. What Control, Alt, G does, which by the way I've never been able to find in any menu structure, it's just a key command. So you'll have to memorize that. It's one of the few things you'll have to memorize. What it does is it ties an adjustment or a layer on top directly to the layer below. So it only affects the layer below. So now if I adjust this blue value, see how my shadow is the only thing that's changing? As opposed to the whole image. So I need to drop this over just a little bit to make that line up with the proper blue value. So it's probably right about there or so. That might be a little too blue, but I need to adjust the lightness because now it's a little too dark. So let me adjust that opacity down. Oops, sorry. It should be on the shadow itself. Adjust that opacity down. Yeah, maybe about like that. So it's really about trying to match it up. Yeah? There you go. It's apparently a clipping mask. Nice job. Thank you. You learn something new every day. See, it happens for me too. Thank you. OK, so now that that blue is close to this blue, it feels like it belongs together pretty well. The other thing, if I were to be really picky about it, and if I looked at the image like this, it would be fine. It's not a big deal. But if I look at the edges of the shadows just a little bit, this shadow has a little bit of blur around the edges. This shadow is sharp. I can take the shadow and I can apply a blur filter to it. If I go to blur, let's do a Gaussian blur. And let's do it at like 0.5 pixels, something like that. Preview should be enabled. And I don't know whether you guys can see that. Yeah, you can see that. See how it just blurs the edges just a little bit? I could even do maybe 1 pixel. This amount is going to vary. Yeah, there you go. Now you can see it. So there it is sharp. There it is a little bit blurry. It matches up with this that much better. So that, once again, was under Filter, Blur, and then Gaussian Blur. Your radius, I did 0.5, and then I ended up doing 1. That's based on the size of your image and how big the people are. So it's not something that's always going to be the same value. Okay? So now that I've done that, we can look at this scene. And number one, the person is the right size to be in the scene. The shadow is the right size. And it starts to feel like the person belongs in the scene itself because he's casting a shadow on the ground. That's how we're grounding the person into the scene. So I can drop in another person. Same strategy here. I'll go to File and then Place. Put her in. Let me shrink this down. Remember, eye level. Now we've got a light problem. The light's on this side, not on that side. So once again, I have to go to my transform, and I'm going to flip horizontal. There we go. So the light's on this side. I'm going to move her over here. Make her a little bit smaller. Remember, we're concentrating on that eye level position. There we go. That looks pretty good. I'll confirm it. Then I'm going to drop in her shadow. So I'll go to File and then Place. And once again, I have to go to Transform, and we're going to flip horizontal. I'm holding down Shift while I do this. Right about like that. Looks good. I'll go ahead and commit to it. Now, this is already tinted blue because it's underneath my color balance. So let me take both the woman and the shadow and pull them out on top. There we go. Whoops. Oh, come on. There we go. OK, sorry, I had those nested underneath, so I needed to organize that a little bit better. OK, so I have the shadow. Same principle here. I need to have her shadow falling off in this direction, so I'll work with my Skew tools. So I'll go to Transform and then Skew. And I'll work one corner at a time. And like I said, this part of it does take some time to get used to. OK, so in this particular case, I have two different feet to line up. So I have to work with the skews there and make sure that they're lining up. I'm going to see if I can zoom in just a little bit there. Make sure that that lines up with her foot there. Notice there's a little bit of a gap because this foot is off the ground. That's the way it should be. Make sure that my angles are about right. Now I have a problem right here, and that's why I'm doing it over here, because of the curve. So I'm going to go ahead and commit to it. It might not be perfect, but I don't want you to sit here and watch me tweak and tweak and tweak. Okay? So in this context, though, I can take her and I can switch to a multiply. There's her shadow. I need to make sure that the shadow is behind the person. You guys get the idea. That's all the same stuff that I've been doing. But in this context, I have a problem because there's a curb in the scene right there. All the rest of the shadows come over and hit the curb and then go up and then continue. So I need to make the same thing happen with her shadow. So first off, the shadow is still what's called a smart object. And I can see that it's a smart object over here in the layers. There's a little file next to it. that's basically linking to the original file. And so instead of having it linked, I need to actually put the file officially in, as if I copied and pasted it into the scene. So I'll do that by right-clicking and saying rasterize layer. And that'll drop that, see that little file icon, that goes away. This is in fact in the scene. Now I need to work with the shadow a little bit more. So the first thing that I'll do is I'm going to come over underneath the rectangle marquee. There is a lasso tool, but below that is something called a Polygonal Lasso. And I like the Polygonal Lasso because I can draw actual straight lines as I'm working with this. So I'm going to draw a line that goes right along that curve. So I'll go right there to there. And then I'm going to work my way around the rest of the shadow. And I'll close it. And you see when I get close to the end, the cursor turns to have a little circle. That closes the selection. Maybe. There it is. And I get the little marching ants. Now I can actually move the shadow. So notice that when I pick move and I move my cursor over it, I get a little scissors icon. It's because it's going to cut that part out for me. Did I pick the wrong? I actually, let me rasterize the shadow. See, this is where naming layers makes a difference. So this should have been woman shadow. And this should be woman, for example. That way I can make sure I'm on the right layer. Now that I'm on the right layer, I'll move this up. If I hold down Shift, by the way, it'll move straight up until it crosses right there. Okay? So essentially, I'm compensating for this now. Now, in reality, part of this length would get distorted in this. But it's a lot harder to worry about transforming and making it go up and over and whatever. So in this context, I think it's easier to just fill in the shadow here and make the shadow a little longer than it otherwise would have been. So what I'll do is I'll use my Polygonal Lasso again, and I'm going to draw a line that goes down. But notice over here that there's a little bit of a lip on the curb. So I want to mimic that just a bit. So let me zoom in here, and I'll start right there, and we'll come down. Looks like it goes in and down, and then it comes out and around about like that. And then it's going to go straight down. There. And then I'll go ahead and fill it in. So I made that little selection by drawing and kind of copying what's happening over here, I hope. Then I'm going to fill this in with this color. So I'm going to use my paintbrush tool right here, but I need that color. So in order to get that, I'll use this eyedropper tool, which is right by the crop tool. And what that does is it allows me to select the actual color that was used. It should be the 75% gray, but I didn't make this, so I'm not entirely positive that somebody did it exactly at 75% gray. So in this case, I'll go ahead and just sample the color from there. Then I can come back to my paintbrush tool, and I can paint in that part of the shadow. I'll go to my rectangular marquee and click off. And it looks like it's not quite the same. Let me, with the woman shadow selected, let me magic wand everything outside of the shadow. And then I'll paint in the whole thing to make it all the same. I'm not quite sure why it didn't get the exact same. Oops. Let me go to select and then inverse. There we go. And now I can paint all of that in. I'm just confirming that it's all exactly the same color. There it is. Now, once again, the shadow here is a little bit dark, so I need to make some adjustments to it. First thing that I'll do is I'll adjust that opacity down. Last time it took about there. The color is again off, so I need that adjustment as well. So let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to do a color balance. Remember, I'm going to tie it to the woman shadow, so Control-Alt-G with the clipping mask. Control-Alt-G. There we go. and then we'll make the adjustments. We'll skew it toward blue. It's right about there or so, maybe not quite that far. Right there. Now I want the edges to be a little bit blurry as well, so I'll go up to Filter and then Gaussian Blur. We'll still do the 1 pixel. I'll say OK, and there it is. Oops. Sorry, I was supposed to do it on the shadow itself. Filter, Gaussian Blur. There it is, like that. So I was then able to integrate her into the scene as well. You guys see how that works? So it's all about picking the right person and then putting the right shadow with it and making the shadow adapt to the scene. That's how you sell this as a collage. And the easiest way to have it not work is to not do the lighting and not do the shadows correctly. So I've done this in the whole scene. I press Control 0. We can see the whole scene. There we are. I have those people put in. It's possible that the people might need a little adjustment. It looks like maybe the levels on this person is adjusted a little bit too nicely. So maybe I need to do a few more adjustments to tone that color down, maybe adjust the saturation on that person just a little bit, or the saturation on this person. Certainly her hair is probably the brightest thing in the whole composition. So I could do that if I wanted by selecting her and then going to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. I'm going to do a Hue and Saturation adjustment. And I'm going to tie it with a clipping mask, Control-Alt-G. There it is. And I'm going to just adjust the saturation down so that she's not quite so vibrant. Just a little bit of adjustment down there. And I can do the same thing with him as well. OK, so that's essentially how I'm integrating into an urban scene, a street scene. Let's look at it if I'm integrating into a landscape scene. So I'm going to go ahead and open up one of those landscape scenes. I'll go to File and then Open. And I'm going to pick one of the landscape scenes. Let's do this one. I don't like the grass in that one as much. No, I don't like that one either. So again, this is one of the challenges, is when you're doing these kinds of things, you want to make sure that you pick the image that works. Okay? So don't be picky about the image. And just because I threw it up there as an example doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best one. The reason that I want this is because I can demonstrate the grass a lot better because the grass is taller. Okay? So in this scene, similarly, when we first look at the scene, we have to think about where is that horizon line. And this is hard because there's no vanishing points. There's no lines to draw. It's kind of more of an intuitive guess than anything else. But in all reality, this was shot at eye level. And probably, given that this is a relatively flat meadow, the horizon line is right about there or so. Okay, so it's an approximation, but it's probably about right. And when we put the people in, we'll get a better idea of how that works. So let me go ahead and put a person in. I'll go into File and then Place. And like I said, I already have some people, so I'm not going to make you waste your time watching me try to find the right people. I'm just going to pick a person that I already have. And I'll go ahead and place her into the scene. Now, as I look at the lighting conditions here, we have shadows being cast. We don't know what the object is that's casting the shadow. It's probably a tree. Okay? But it's casting it from right down toward the left, which means that the light is kind of behind us and to the right. We notice that all of the trees over here on this side of the valley are in sun. Therefore, having her in sun probably makes some sense. I'm going to go ahead and transform and make her fit in the scene. Same rules apply here. We need her eye level to be approximately where that horizon is. And we're going to adjust her height and her placement based on where that eye level is. I'm going to make her a little bit smaller such that she's in this brighter patch of the scene. I'll put her over here. Remember, rule of thirds composition. You know, all that stuff should be in the back of your head. So we'll put her right about there, and I'll commit to it. Let me zoom in a bit so we can see her. you know what, I'm going to transform her a little bit more. Make her a little bit bigger. Yeah, I'd say right about there. So same problem applies here, where she looks like she's floating if we look at her feet. She doesn't feel like she's part of the scene at all. So we need to, first off, we need to make her feel like she's part of the scene. And to do that, we're going to do a strategy where we're going to take a piece of the background landscape and we're going to put it on top of her. So I'm going to use the rectangular marquee here, and I'm going to select some of the background. So we'll select maybe that much of the background. I want to make sure I'm on the background layer when I do this, and I'm going to go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste, which creates, let me make everything small, there, that's the piece that I cut out and pasted. And if I turn on the background, we can't tell that it's there, because it's in the exact same place. So what I'll do is I'll take and I'll put this piece of landscape partly on top of her. So if I just took this and I put it on top, like that, okay, well, yeah, I guess she's kind of integrated into the landscape, but it's not quite, still not working. Okay, let's put, okay, well, now she's kind of cut off of mid-thigh. That doesn't really work. So let's figure out how to make her integrate a little bit better. Let me turn off the background. We'll work with these two pieces for just a second. I'm going to select the magic wand tool, and I'm going to select the layer with the lady on it, and I'll select outside of her. So it gives me her silhouette. I want inside, so I'll go to Select and then Inverse so that I get a selection that's just inside. And now I'll move up onto my grass, and I'll press the Delete key, which then cuts her out. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's the exact same place that I just was. So what's the point of doing that? Well, the point is that now this layer is still on top of her, but I can use something like the clone stamp tool to copy over parts of the grass on top of her. Now, if I just use the regular clone stamp tool, it's just a round brush. It wouldn't really do it. So instead, I'm going to go up to my brushes, and I'm going to scroll down here, and there's a brush number 134, which lo and behold is called the grass brush. I'm going to pick that grass brush, and I'm going to work with the clone stamp tool. And you guys already saw the clone stamp tool in action before. Notice I have to use the bracket keys to make it a little bit bigger, and I think that is going to be too big. We'll see. We can go about there. I'm going to hold down Alt to copy from. Yeah, it just wasn't registering the correct size. There we go. About like that. I'm going to hold down Alt to copy from, and then I'm going to work my way over the top of her with some grass. I'm going to copy from over here. Let's cover up that a little bit. A little bit more right in there. Perfect. So you see how that's working with a grass-like material to start to make her feel like she's in the scene. And if I turn on the background, now suddenly she's kind of integrated into the scene. She's not floating anymore. And that's the idea, is to ground her into the scene, which is good. Now, I told you before that, yes, this is good. She's in the scene. That's good. But remember, people always cast shadows in the scene. So we still have to deal with the shadow. So this gets a little bit more complicated because of the grass. And I'll show you how to do it. We'll go to File and then Place. And I'm going to bring in her silhouette. Same thing. You guys realize now why I made you make the gray versions, right? Okay. So let's make that a little bit smaller. I'll shrink her down like that. It may be helpful at this point to turn off these background layers. It's not going to let me. Let me commit to this for just a second. Let me turn off the background layers so that we're just working with the people here. And let me rename this to be Shadow. And then I'll go back to my transform. A little bit of arrow keys. A little bit bigger. Oops. Hold down Shift, not Control. That was my mistake. There we go. So we're getting her approximately the right size. And now I need to, once again, skew that to match up. Now the good news here is we're in a kind of a nature scene. So we don't necessarily know where the shadows fall. It's just kind of, I need a shadow generally in that direction. So I'll go into my edit and then transform and then skew. And I'll start to work the shadows down and over. Probably going to need to do some adjustments here. Yeah, we'll do it about like that. Okay, I might be a little off, but it should still work. Remember, this one is less precise because we don't have the ground and we don't have reference points. We just need there to be a shadow. So I'll go ahead and I'll commit to that as our shadow. Once again, I'll take the shadow and I'll switch to multiply so that it's darkening the background. Sorry, wrong one. Multiply. There we go. And so it's darkening the background. The problem here is that, let me turn back on her feet that are covered up. The problem is that the shadow, it looks like it's on pavement. It looks like it's on a flat surface, and we can't have that. We need to make it look like it's on grass. So I'm going to work with just the shadow for a second. So let me turn off everything else except for the shadow. And I'm going to zoom in on the shadow like this. So first thing is I need this to start to feel like it's part of the grass. So I'm going to use the clone stamp once again, and I'm going to add grass to the whole backside of this shadow, little spikes. And I'll do that. I could use clone stamp, and I could copy from, oh, sorry, first thing, this is still a smart layer, smart object. So I need to rasterize this before I can do this. So let me rasterize the layer. There we go. And I could copy from the shadow itself. Let me make this a little bit smaller. Copy from the shadow, and I could draw along the backside like that. The problem is I'm restricted so much because there's not a lot of gray there. So I'm going to help myself out a little bit by giving an extra block of gray down at the bottom. So I'm going to do this. I will use the paint bucket tool. I could actually, I'll just use the brush here, and I'll fill in that gray. Like that. I'm going to ultimately delete this. And now I can clone stamp from down here along here. Come on. Sorry, I have to deselect it, then I can clone stamp. From here, right along there. Uh-oh, colors don't match. Let me go back. Eyedropper, select the color. And then I need to repaint this section. There we go. Like that. Deselect, clone stamp, hold down Alt, click, let go, and then I'm going to work my way toward the back side. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're just trying to put some make that a little bit bigger. There we go. That's a little bit better. Now notice when I get up toward the top and the bottom, where it's really thin, I get grass, unfortunately, on both sides. There's little butts of the grass that are sticking out. Don't worry about that for right now. We're going to solve that in just a second. So I'm going to work my way along. And the idea is to make that line go away. So there's a line that was the edge of the shadow, and we're trying to make that part go away. All right, right like that. Now, on the front side, I want, again, there to be grass. But this time I want the sun to be there, so I'm going to paint with white instead of the gray. So let me select this rectangle again. And I'm going to paint with white. it's so what the rectangle does is when I'm clone stamping, I can copy from a bigger region. I don't run out and get my clone stamps clipped from the edge, because remember, a clone stamp fundamentally copies from wherever you go across. So if I went across the bottom edge, I'd get a line, and I don't want that. So I just have a big colored fill region to be able to do this. So let me go ahead with the clone stamp one more time. I'll hold down Alt, copy from down here, and this time in the front, I'm copying over some white grass. Like that. So unlike the street scene, where the edges were rather sharp, in a grassy field, we're not really going to have sharp shadows. There's so much grass and stuff that's blocking it, we're not going to be able to discern what is accurate to shadow. It's just more, is there a shadow there at all? So there's my little shadow. That was a little far out. I might have to do a little bit of work around. Notice, since this is white, it's going to become transparent on a multiply anyway, so I don't worry about deleting it afterward. So I'll just leave that there. Let's turn back on this little piece of grass there with her feet in it. So this is a little challenging. I might need to add a little bit more shadow around her feet. Maybe I need to get rid of a little bit more, but let's see what it looks like once she's there. All right, let me take the shadow, and I'm going to move that up just a little bit, I think. That. Apply. I'm going to take a little bit more of this shadow out right there. So let me go back to my clone stamp. Copying from here. That was too much. And that shadow still needs to be up a little higher. Just making sure you find the right spot for it, the happy medium spot. There it is. And now if I were to turn on the rest of the background, you can see that the grass is now, I think my angle is off. I think it needed to be a little bit down. But you can see that the edges of the shadow now match up with the grass. And maybe they need a little bit longer blades of grass, but you essentially get the idea here. So in this case, because, let me zoom out a little bit. Yeah, the shadow looks a little bit too upright there. Let me go ahead and transform that one more time. And this is the advantage of working with the shadows in a landscape scene, is it's not nearly as precise. So the fact that I can just do that makes it a little bit easier. So there it is. Now she has her shadow cast into the scene as well, and she feels like she's part of this particular scene. So what I want you to do for exercise 108 is I want you to work in both a streetscape scene and a landscape scene. So you're going to post two images. One's landscape, one's the streetscape. At least put one person in each. So get through the street scene, put one person in. Once you're happy with that, move on to the landscape, put one person in. If you have time at the end, go back and put another person in. The more practice you have with this, the easier it is later on in the semester when you have to do this. So we're going to be doing this many more times. Now, recognize it took me however long today to talk, almost an hour to talk you through this process. This is just one step in a much larger 1 hour lecture later on. So we need to master this step now so that you'll have it for later on. Make sense? OK. Are there any questions? I know it's a lot to take in.